Well, good morning, and welcome to the MAP Talk webinar on local governance, civil discourse, and social media. My name is George Hammond. I'm director of the Economic and Business Research Center in the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona. We're also joined this morning by Jennifer Pullen, our excellent MAP dashboard coordinator. So we'll start off with some webinar details. First of all, the MAP Talk will be recorded. We will post the recording on the dashboard in a day or two, so you can revisit the webinar anytime you like. Now, the webinar will be conducted in conference mode, and that means that everyone will be muted with the exception of our presenter today. If you'd like to ask a question, you can send Jennifer an email anytime at jpullen@eller.arizona.edu. And we'll also open things up for questions at the end of the presentation. Now, the MAP dashboard is made possible by our sustaining sponsors and our partners. Our partners are the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona, the Pima Association of Governments, the Southern Arizona Leadership Council, Sun Corridor Incorporated, and the University of Arizona. Our sustaining sponsors are Tucson Electric Power, Thomas R. Brown Foundations, and Freeport-McMoran Foundation. Now, the dashboard has recently received international recognition. The dashboard won the 2018 Impact Award from the Community Indicators Consortium. And the dashboard has now received international, national, and local recognition, and we're really proud of that. I also want to make sure that you know that you can find the dashboard twice a month in the Arizona Daily Star. At the last Sunday of the month, you'll find the dashboard featured in the business section. And on the first Monday of the month, you'll find the dashboard in the health section. So be sure and check out the Arizona Daily Star. Now, in addition to the core indicators that are available on the dashboard, we also do a large number of feature articles, and these cover a wide range of topics. Recently, we've published feature articles on affordability, housing affordability, including how renters fare. We've had feature articles on chronic disease incidence, on water independence, and the power of innovation. More and more over the past couple of years, we've published level data at a high degree of geographic resolution, meaning you can now drill down to the town and the city level in Southern Arizona and see how your local community fares across a wide range of metrics. We also have some articles showing how local organizations are making use of the map. So be sure and check those out. In addition, as part of the MAP dashboard project, we fund U of A faculty to do research in their areas of expertise, and these are white paper grants. And our presenter today is going to talk about some research which was funded as a result of a white paper grant. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Steve Rains from the Department of Communication at the University of Arizona, and he's going to talk about local governance, civil discourse, and social media. So Steve, take it away.
Thanks, George. I'd like to start today by first expressing our gratitude for the MAP funding. Our team has been working on the topic of civility, and civility in Southern Arizona in particular, for a number of years. And so this project presented a unique opportunity for us to look at civility in the context of social media, and in particular how the individual, the lay public interacts with our elected officials from here in Tucson. So to provide an overview before we get started, we know that civility has been an increasing concern among the American public. We hear more and more about the tenor of discourse in our society and how it's becoming more problematic, and civility seems to lie at the heart of that. Social media has oftentimes been identified as the cause, or at least the place where a lot of this incivility happens. So what we wanted to do in this project is look at incivility from and directed at Tucson area elected officials on social media. And so we focused explicitly on Twitter because Twitter is one place where citizens can directly communicate with their elected officials, and presumably elected officials can respond. And we examined their behavior over an 18-month period during 2018 and 2019. So in the remainder of my talk today, I'll first provide some background about incivility. Then I'll talk about how we acquired and analyzed our data. We'll cover the results. And finally, we'll wrap up with some recommendations about improving civility in the Tucson area. So we know that civility is a central element of effective democracy. In order for us to have a functioning democracy, we need to talk about ideas, and we need to be able to do that in a way where we can have disagreements. So disagreements is really a central tenet of a functioning democracy. But in order to do that effectively, we need to also be civil. It's perfectly fine to agree or disagree with someone, but we need to be able to do that in a manner that allows us to still have productive discussions. And what we found is that Americans are increasingly concerned with incivility. I have a link to a study, it was a national survey, and what they found was that 93% of the public felt that our nation had a civility problem. And so that's overall across the country as a whole, but we also know that incivility is an issue here in Southern Arizona. So my co-authors, Kate Kensky and Kevin Coe and I, did a study in 2011. And in that study, what we did is we took a 3-week census of the Arizona Daily Star news articles that were posted online. And what we focused on was the online discussions of those articles. So we captured every single discussion that occurred over a 3-week period during fall 2011. And what we did is we coded those discussions for instances of incivility. And we looked at 5 different types. And what we found that incivility was quite common among Arizona Daily Star readers. In fact, 1 in 5 comments contained one of our forms of incivility. And 14% of our comments contained name calling. And name calling was by far the most prominent. And I think name calling is really, when people think about incivility, it's probably the one type that rises to the top of mind most frequently. So one thing that was unique about the Arizona Daily Star article or our study was that we were focusing on the lay public and how they interact with one another. So these are just everyday citizens talking about news. What we need to know more about in general about incivility, as well as incivility in our local area, though, is about how we interact with local officials in social media, as well as how local officials use social media and the degree to which they're uncivil. And so what we wanted to do in this project is we're focused specifically on Twitter, and looked at Twitter use by local elected officials at 3 different levels of government, representing city councils and mayors in the state legislature, as well as our federally elected officials to the Senate and the House of Representatives. And we looked at incivility directed to those folks by everyday citizens, as well as the incivility in our officials' Twitter contributions. I've talked a lot about incivilities, and what I want to do now is define what I mean by incivility, because I think there's a number of misconceptions about what this concept is. So we define incivility as features of discussion that convey an unnecessarily disrespectful tone toward the forum, its participants, or its topics. And this definition comes from our 2011 study looking at Arizona Daily Star readers. A core idea I want to communicate here is that incivility, it's okay to disagree. And incivility is not about squelching disagreement. That's sometimes the claim that I hear, is that incivility is used to make everybody agree and everyone happy. And that's not the case at all. As I mentioned previously, we firmly believe that disagreement's at the core of an effective and functioning democracy, but we need to be able to do that in a way where we can disagree respectfully. And that's what incivility is about. It's about showing people that, yeah, I don't see things the same way that you do, but doing that in a way that shows respect for them as another human being. In this project, we decided to focus specifically on name calling, and we did that for a couple of reasons. One is that, as I showed in our previous work, name calling was the most frequent type of incivility we found. We've also done some other research that suggests that when people tend to think about what incivility is, they're most likely to identify name calling as the sort of quintessential form of incivility. In this project, we operationally define name calling as mean-spirited or disparaging words directed at another person or group of people, including derogatory nicknames. We also went beyond just simply the words used, and we looked at incivility in the case of stylistic features. So the way in which the words were used and presented in text was also a factor that we used to identify name calling. Name calling is unique in that it's directed at another symbol-producing entity. So what I mean by that is typically a person, but it could also be a group, like a political party, or an organization as a whole can be called names. So with an understanding of what incivility is and name calling is, I'm going to briefly overview our research design, and then I'll talk about these issues in specific. The first thing we tried to do is we identified all elected officials in our Tucson area with a Twitter account. And then we captured all their tweets made by them and directed at them over an 18-month period. We then trained a machine learning classifier to examine or identify instances of incivility. And we did that on a sample of tweets that we had coded with humans. We then applied the classifier to the entire corpus of tweets, which was about 100,000 total. And then we used those results to examine trends in incivility from and directed at our local elected officials. So the first step was acquiring the data. And what we did is we looked at people representing the Tucson area. And so we first tried to identify all our representatives during 2018. And so after coming up with the people who represented Tucson, we then tried to find whether or not they had a Twitter account. And so we had 3 senators with a Twitter account. You might be thinking, how did you have 3 senators? So to address that, you might recall that John McCain passed away and John Kyle took over. So during 2018, we actually did have 3 senators. They all had a Twitter account. Our 3 House of Representative members covering the Tucson area all had a Twitter account. 5 members of the Arizona State Senate and 11 members of the State House that represent Tucson had a Twitter account. Mayor and City Council were a little bit more difficult to find. We looked at the Mayor and City Council's office from Tucson, Oro Valley, Sahuarita, Marana, and South Tucson. However, only members from Tucson, Oro Valley, and Sahuarita had a Twitter account. So again, this is not all of our elected officials, but it's simply those ones who use Twitter. I will note, though, that I think it was about 70% of the Senate and State House used Twitter. All of our federal officials use Twitter. The numbers started to become a little bit thinner when we looked at mayor's and city's council office, although we did find 11 people overall. So what we did then is we had each of those people and we identified their username on Twitter, and we used Twitter's application programming interface, or API, to collect or download tweets from those individuals and direct it at those individuals. And we collected these tweets at 2 time points in April and June. And what Twitter's API does is it essentially allows us to download in bulk all the tweets directed at or by these individuals. Our collection span began on January 1, 2018 and concluded on June 8th, 2019. So we had about 18 months total of tweets. We had about 25,000 tweets authored by our elected officials. So these are tweets generated by the individual elected officials from the Tucson area. And we had about 70,000 that were directed at. And the way we identify tweets directed at a local official is in the actual tweet made, they use the @ symbol and then the elected official's username. So this is the way you can contact people directly or tag people directly in a Twitter post. And this approach allows us to identify instances when people are talking directly to our local elected officials. One note here is I want to mention is that we excluded retweets from our tweet counts. So a retweet is like an email forward. And because they're not the original speaker's message, we decided to exclude those. So our data set only consists then of tweets made by either elected officials or citizens directed at those elected officials. Here we can look at the tweet counts across different types of groups. On the left, we have tweets by officials, and on the right, we have tweets directed at officials. You can see over that 18-month period, state officials made the most tweets. They made almost 20,000 tweets. City level officials only made about 1,500, and federal officials made about 4,000. When we look at tweets directed at officials, these are just total numbers here. Federal officials by far received the most with 46,000, but state level officials still received 22,000 tweets, and city officials received about 3,500 tweets. If we look at these numbers across time, what we have is on top we have tweets made by officials, and on the bottom tweets directed at local officials. You can see that in terms of tweets made by officials, the blue line is for state level officials, and you can see that peaks around October and November of 2018 around election time. So you can see they become most active then, and then they drop off at the start of the new year. In terms of our tweets directed at officials, all the lines are fairly flat except we see a big bump toward the end of 2019 in tweets directed at federal officials. So what we did with these tweets, we had 96,416 total, is in order to analyze the data, we realized that there are no way humans could code 96,000 tweets. There are not enough hours in the day. And so what we did is we took a random sample of about 4,000 of those tweets, and we had them evaluated by trained coders. So we had 4 graduate students in communication who received 20 hours in training on how to identify a name calling in a tweet. And what we did is we had each of those 4 coders evaluated the same 400 tweets. And we use that as a way to determine whether or not they're reliable. And by reliable, I mean they simply see incivility consistently in the data. So if you gave them a tweet, they could consistently say, all of them would say, yes, it's there, or no, it's not there. And Krippendorf's alpha is a measure of intercoder agreement. It's scaled between 0 and 1. Typically with this metric, anything over 0.70 is pretty good. So 0.86 is fairly high reliability. And what that does is provides us with confidence that our coders are seeing things consistently in the data. As I mentioned earlier, just to refresh your memory, we define name calling as this mean-spirited or disparaging words directed at another person or group of people, including derogatory nicknames. So that was our operational definition we used to try to detect name calling in this set of tweets. So I mentioned previously we had 90,000 total tweets, and there was no way we could code them with humans. We just simply don't have enough time, and there's really not a lot of value in using all that time. So what we did then is we used machine learning as a way to scale up our content analysis. So we used the 3,800 tweets coded by our trained graduate students, and those served as our ground truth. And by ground truth, I simply mean that those are the tweets that we knew with a great deal of confidence that incivility either existed or didn't exist. So all those 3,800 tweets have been evaluated by our coders, and we had a clear sense of yes or no, did they contain name calling. So with that information, we're able to train a machine learning classifier to be able to detect incivility automatically. So we split the 3,800 tweets into what's called a training set and a test set. And in the training set, what we did is we're essentially refining the algorithm. We're making it more accurate in terms of using what's in the tweet to predict whether or not that tweet contains incivility. And again, we know whether it does or not because we have the ground truth. We have the coders who have actually evaluated it for incivility. Then what we did is the test set is a separate subsample that hasn't yet been looked at by the machine. Once we think we have the algorithm set, or what I mean by that is operating effectively, we then use it on the test set, which we can allows us to demonstrate the effectiveness of the algorithm. So essentially the test set allows us to show that, yeah, in a brand new set of data that the algorithm hasn't seen, it can predict accurately whether or not the tweets contain incivility. So I want to give you a little bit of background on the classifier we use, but I don't want to get into the weeds here on this. I'm happy to answer questions about the classifier, but I think that's probably beyond the scope of what most people are interested in. So we used a classifier, it's a neural network classifier. It's called BERT, or Bidirectional Encoder Representations from Transformers. The key thing I think I want you to take away is that the results of the classifier with our training set showed 76% precision and 76% recall. And precision is simply how often the classifier's prediction maps onto humans' predictions. So 76% of the time, what the human said was uncivil, the classifier also identified as uncivil. Recall is about the degree to which the classifier is able to pick up human-judged incivilities. So 76% of the time when humans said, yes, this is uncivil, the classifier was able to identify that as an uncivil tweet. So what this really boils down to is that we think the classifier was reasonably effective in identifying incivility in this large data set. So what I'm going to do is show you some examples of incivility identified by the classifier. What I've done here is I've cropped out the part of the tweet. This is not an entire tweets. These are just the part of the tweets containing incivility. And these are all word for word what appears in the actual tweet, with one exception that I've sort of changed to make it a little less offensive. So the classifier was able to pick up some things that I think anybody would say is uncivil, very obvious things, things like nobody cares about this crybaby trader or his family. So crybaby trader is pretty over the top. It's uncivil. I think most people would agree. He's an idiot. That's another one. A pathological liar, a hypocrite. This last one I changed because to make it somewhat less offensive, although I think it's still pretty offensive. But calling somebody an a-hole, in my mind, I think that's what the typical person thinks of when they think about incivility, and especially in a context like Twitter. They think of over-the-top, profanity-laden efforts to call someone a name, like this one here. And don't get me wrong, there were a large number of these in our data set. But what we also picked up that I want to point out are things that I think are much more subtle, and they fit the form of name calling. They're absolutely name calling, but they're not over the top in the same way. And I don't think they're what people would be as aware of as being name calling. So for example, I think you're a closet Democrat. So that's a form of name calling. It's certainly not a compliment. And you continue to be complicit. So that's another more subtle form of a way to call someone a name that's, again, it's certainly derogatory and intended as being mean-spirited. You are irrelevant, or the one I was most struck by is you are less relevant than ever. So that's a very subtle way of critiquing someone in a way I think that's unnecessary to convey a point. And it captures this very nuanced approach to incivility. Last but not least, nobody wants to hear an uninformed appointed senator that has never had a town hall. So the idea of being uninformed could be another instance of, not could be, it certainly is another instance of name calling, but just this more subtle variety. So let's take a look at what we found. Across all of the tweets from elected officials, what we have here is we have the proportion of tweets. Now these are by elected officials containing incivility, and it's broken out by level of government. So you can see that federal officials, 3.17% of their tweets were uncivil. 1.5% of state level government tweets were official, and city was 2.88%. Across the group, less than 5% of all tweets are uncivil. And so I've given you the raw number here as the approximate raw numbers to give you a sense of what we're looking at in those terms. About 450 total of 25,000 tweets contained incivility. And so you might ask yourself, well, is that a lot or a little? And I think the thing that stands out to our group the most was that federal officials actually used incivility twice as much as state officials. Now, granted that overall rates are low, it's still double the amount. And that's something I'm going to come back to when we talk about conclusions. If we look at our trends over time, one thing I want to point out is that the city and state officials, if you remember, the volume of city and federal officials, if you recall, the volume of tweets they generated, so that's the red and the green lines, was quite small. So these peaks and valleys in the green and the red lines, we don't attribute a lot of meaning to. State officials, though, they produced a quite a bit larger volume of tweets, and so we're much more confident in drawing conclusions from theirs. And so if you follow that blue line, what you're going to see is a peak right around October and November 2018. And if you think about, well, what happened in October and November 2018, you might recall that we had an election. And so you can see that the tweets tend to peak for our state officials there around election time. And so you can think about how that might be a product of that election environment, having people more inclined to be uncivil there than at other times of the year. So this was incivility by our elected officials over time. What I want to look at now is incivility directed at our local officials. So here we see in the plot, we see three different groups. Again, we have incivility directed at our federal officials, state officials, and city officials. You can see that less than 5% of all the tweets directed at city and state officials contain incivility, but a whopping 15% of tweets directed at federal officials. So federal officials received almost 3 times as much incivility from the lay public than did our city and state level officials. If we look at raw numbers, you can see that city and state were much less than 1,000 in raw tweets, but the federal officials received 7,000 tweets. So that's a lot of name calling in their inbox. Here are our tweets directed at federal officials over time. Our green line is our federal officials, our blue is state, and our red is city. You can see that city and state are kind of variable, but we have this massive peak in federal officials. And if the red line across the graph there is at 7.5%. If you look, the green line, for the most part, stays pretty well below 7.5%, except for this massive spike at the end of 2018. And if you think about what was occurring at the end of 2018, one of our state senators was retiring and didn't try to compete for office again. And a lot of that negative sentiment was from looking at the data, was directed at him. But you can see there's a massive increase there at the end of that time period. So in terms of summarizing our key trends, we found that there's a general hesitance to use incivility by elected officials. However, we will note that federal officials used almost twice as much incivility, although it was still fairly low at 3%. Incivility directed at public officials varied dramatically by our level of representation. Federal officials received about 3 times more incivility than state officials. And as a reference point, if we go back to our Arizona Daily Star study that Kevin Cohen, Kate Kensky, and I conducted back in 2011, we found that 14% of the 6,000 posts contain name calling. And again, in the Arizona Daily Star, these are average citizens talking to one another. So you can see that our state level officials use much more or much less incivility than do Arizona Daily Star readers. But federal officials, in terms of the incivility they receive from the lay public, maps onto that number. You'll notice, though, that our city and state officials tend to receive much less incivility than we found in the Arizona Daily Star. So what are our takeaways from this? One of the takeaways is, again, with the caveat that incivility is fairly low among all of our elected officials, we still can't help but note that federal officials used quite a bit more incivility, double the incivility of our state level officials. And when we think about it, we feel confident that federal officials weren't any more effective in conveying information. Or put differently, state level officials weren't any less effective without using incivility. So incivility wasn't bogging down state officials and making them unable to communicate effectively. So if there's no really gain in information by using incivility, we think that perhaps federal officials might consider not using it so much. It doesn't seem like there's anything useful being gained with its use. And so, as with state officials, we recommend that federal officials try to use incivility even less. We know the numbers are low overall, but clearly from the data produced by state officials, it could be even lower. The second recommendation comes from our finding in the discrepancy in incivility directed at federal officials and incivility directed at state and city level officials. And we wonder why, if people are so comfortable or uncomfortable employing incivility when addressing a mayor or city council person, shouldn't they feel that same level of discomfort addressing a US senator? What makes it more okay to use incivility when directed at our federal officials? We're not at all surprised by this finding. There's some data showing that people tend to be happy with their local officials, but then when you ask them about government as a whole, they feel very negatively. So that disconnect kind of shows up here with being happy with our city council members or our state representatives, but not with our federal representatives. But we still think that it would be wise to think about, well, what makes it okay to call federal officials names, but not to call our local representatives names? It seems like the norm should be that we try to be respectful to all. So with that, I'll open the floor to questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. That was really interesting. I think particularly with the emphasis here at the University of Arizona on the fourth industrial revolution, seeing what you were able to do to scale up the number of tweets you're able to analyze using machine learning is particularly interesting. So this is really a cool research topic. One thing I want to emphasize for the attendees today is that you can find a great little blog post on this topic written by Steve and his co-authors on the dashboard at the moment. And there's also a link to their full white paper where you can get a more detailed treatment of the issues and the approaches that Steve and his co-authors use. So be sure to check that out. So I will kick things off with the first question, and I'm curious about the research agenda here. Where are you headed next in terms of exploring these issues?
Right now, what we're working on are a series of studies looking at incivility in the which will be the 2020 election. So we're already starting to collect data on the primaries and looking at incivility on Twitter. But what we're trying to look at it specifically directed at things that our officials say. So we're using what are called quote tweets, where people have, they quote something that an official will say and then respond to it directly. So that's going to allow us to capture the closest thing we have to sort of citizen elected official interaction online.
Oh, cool. Well, I look forward to seeing that. So I'll open it up now to our attendees. So any questions from the audience this morning?
George, this is Jennifer. I had an email sent to me. I just wanted to read it. One of the participants sent a comment that they said that they commented on a Tucson Mayoral's candidate's campaign on Facebook, and an ex-candidate called them rude instead of discussing this candidate's third attempt to run for public office. I thought it was not civil as she attacked me, not the statement or the issue. Just to let you know, it happens on Facebook quite a bit too. Your research may want to check Facebook as well, besides Twitter.
Yeah, that's a fantastic suggestion, and we're absolutely aware that it's happening there as well. You know, one of the reasons I think that people aren't studying Facebook as much is that Facebook is not as open as Twitter. So what I mean by that is Twitter will allow us access to their data, and Facebook's very much closed, and they don't want to allow people access, and it makes it tougher on our end to do that. We would love to get at incivility on that particular platform. We just face these structural challenges from the companies who run them. But absolutely, I think that our results would generalize, and we would tend to see it in contexts like Facebook as well, and even other forms of social media. I wouldn't be surprised if incivility didn't show up on things like Instagram, where it's mostly even text-based.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And thank you to the person who sent the email for that comment. Any other questions from the audience?
I have an additional question, if that's all right. I was wondering if there's any data or research out there that allows you to compare the occurrence of incivility for Tucson area government to other regions around the U.S. that are similar sized?
That's a fantastic question. That's actually one of the questions we had, and something we have on our to-do list is we've identified cities of a similar size as Tucson, and what we just need to do is one of the projects we're going to try to accomplish is essentially what you mentioned, and see if there's any locale differences too. Because it's tough to tell if what we're seeing here is a Tucson effect or if it generalizes more broadly. And so but comparing us to other cities would make that very much possible to do. We could even see if there's like a regional effect. And so that's absolutely something on our radar, and to our knowledge, it hasn't been done yet, but we would love to pursue that at some point.
Great, thanks.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, this is Justin Williams. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm working on a project to strengthen civic renewal, and in listening to your presentation, I'm curious if you see the ability to use this sort of as a training development activity, where the participants opt in and get personal feedback as an effort to try and improve their own civility.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. It's because I think especially some of the more subtle forms, we're not aware that it does constitute name calling, and we could, express those ideas in a way that doesn't attack the person individually. One of the things I'm aware of, we're not doing anything, but I'm aware that the National Institute for Civil Discourse, actually, it's run out of the University of Arizona and actually funded our first project. They have a number of trainings that people can get involved with, and will do just what you mentioned in terms of showing people what it means to be uncivil and fostering more civil behavior. And so the NICD is another partner here on campus that has a number of resources targeted to just this very issue. I was at they had a retreat at the end of September, and they were talking to us about how they're working to try to spread the word about their resources.
Great, I appreciate that. If would you be interested in a follow-up conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I have my emails on the screen, and my contact information, if you Google my name and University of Arizona, is on the webpage. Feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to set up a time to talk.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. Any other questions? Okay, well, hearing none, I want to thank Steve for a terrific white paper for the dashboard and a terrific presentation. We really enjoyed hearing from you. And we look forward to seeing your research in the future.
Yeah, thank you, George, for your time. And to all of you listeners, thank you for your time as well. It was really a pleasure to get to share our work.
That's great. Okay, thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.